All right, we are live. It is another fun and exciting Hangops on this fabulous Friday. It is November 14th, 2014, and I am full of caffeine and happy to be awake. So it's been a crazy week. There's still stuff happening. We want to try to touch on a few things. To start with, we want to do a little sort of drum roll shout out, get everyone amped up for SysAdvent, which is coming up. So I'm going to hand it over to this year's organizer and Hangops co-host Chris Weber to tell us what's going on with that.
So thank you to everybody that has already signed up to be an editor or to be an author. The contributions there are so helpful, including, and in case people don't hear that word editor, like the editing staff is just as important as the author staff because that we all make so many mistakes, and it's great to have that extra set of eyes, and it makes my life so much better. It's not even funny. Um, so just getting ramped up for that. We've done a logo redesign, so if you go out to sysadvent.com, you'll see a new logo. I just put the order in for stickers today, and we'll see where that goes from here. So just looking forward to our first post on December 1st. I want to say it's Bridget Cromhout, who's been on Hangops before. And yeah, looking forward to it.
And what is SysAdvent?
Oh, that's probably a good point. I got that, like I sent that out to the Lopsa email list, and I was like, oh, of course everybody. Oh, I guess not everybody knows. So really quick, for those that don't know, an Advent calendar is a calendar normally with chocolates inside where you count down the number of days to Christmas. Well, we're going to do that with SysAdvent articles. We've been doing it since, gosh, I think 2008-ish. And I've been kind of leading it up for this will be my second year. So each day we post an article right around midnight-ish PST, or between midnight EST and midnight PST, depending on how things work out. And that article is some neat thing about systems administration. So we've had everything from interesting fiction stories written about systems administration to put things in perspective to things about culture. I want to say I've seen Docker, Go, lots and lots of stuff. Yeah, it's going to be awesome. So look forward to it, sysadvent.com.
Yeah, it should be really good. I've contributed on and off the last few years. I'm going to do an intro to Kafka and Zookeeper, so it should be good. Okay, cool. So I think we wanted to kind of start things off with talk a little bit about reInvent. You know, there's certainly a lot of stuff that's topical and relevant for that. We got a couple people on that were there. Let's start with Darren. With you, why don't you introduce yourself? You're new to Hangops, so welcome to the
Thank you,
community,
sir.
and who you are, what you do, and then why you're at reInvent and what you saw.
Cool. Thank you, sir. My name is Darren Froese. I'm with Datadog. I'm a site reliability engineer. What I do there is keep the site running and make it fast and deploy new stuff. We were here at reInvent because we're an AWS partner, and we run all of our stuff on AWS. So we had a big booth in the front, and it was interesting. It was a interesting show. It was my first time at reInvent, my first time in Vegas. So there's a lot of new stuff for me there.
Very nice.
So I might have missed the last bit of that question if there was more.
Uh, yeah. So just like, what did you see?
Sorry.
Obviously you were there as a vendor, so I'm sure you spent a lot of time, right, doing the vendory stuff. But so just kind of, like,
Sure.
what did you participate in? What did you see? Who were we talking to? Just, you know.
Fair enough. No, I spent a lot of the time in the booth on the show floor, talking to people, giving demos. Really, the theme, part of the theme that we saw for this year was Docker, 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 and add a couple more Dockers to that. It was pretty much everywhere. I had probably a 45-minute conversation with a marketing fellow from Microsoft who wanted to understand Docker, and in the end, he was really excited, but he was so confused. I want to know So, it was there was a lot of different people, It seemed like some less cloud native people and lots of big business were here, some big defense contractors and things like that, and they were all interested in the cloud and interested in Docker, but weren't sure what to make of it.
So I want to say one of your coworkers gave one of the only talks on Docker there. Is that correct?
You're right. Alexi gave a talk. There was two talks on Docker as far as I know, and he gave the first one about monitoring Docker. They had to move the room a couple times because they had so many people trying to get in, and in the end, it was a little bit of mayhem, but it went well, and I think he did a good job. I didn't get a chance to see it. I was still in the booth, so but yeah, so many announcements and so many new things. So
Very nice. What was your biggest takeaway? Biggest thing, like you left and said, I want to go home and play with that.
For me, it's Kubernetes. I've been wanting to play with it a bit, and I've just spun up a cluster a couple times, but never had time to really put it through its paces. With the new not EC3, but Amazon's container service. Um, so I don't know what's under the hood there. I know Google has Kubernetes under the hood. I know CoreOS is doing some stuff with Kubernetes. So personally, I want to take a bit more time and work through that. We're doing some. I just started with Datadog in July, so I've been doing a lot of preparatory work to get to where we can start deploying more stuff in containers. And so now I'm getting really close to where I can start to feel the containers start to ship. And so now with Kubernetes and some of these other options, we want to take a closer look and see if it's a good fit for us.
Very nice. Okay, so I have to ask, has anyone started looking at was there anyone else, since we've got a bunch of people here, were there any other people that had like specific things that they were looking at going, oh my God, I want to play with that? I know I've got personal things, but I'm curious as to what other people thought was kind of neat based on just announcements, whether you were there or not.
I could chime in here if I can actually stay connected, but I don't think there's anything that I say I want to play with, but the Amazon Aurora stuff looked pretty awesome. If it actually delivers on the promise of what they say it can do, it's pretty interesting.
That's basically just like crazy optimized MySQL, right?
I think they'd be kind of doing it doing a little disservice. I mean, it's very reliable. It's replicated like crazy. You're able just to write SQL, so you don't have to do the most tricks, like denormalize your keys, no joins, or vice versa. So I think from a new person on AWS, it could be really compelling versus a key value store like Dynamo that they provide. So
interesting. Anyone else had things?
Aurora was really interesting to me. And so I read through I think it was the blog post, the blog that Jeff Barr usually writes to. And what essentially sounded like is that, essentially Aurora, right, it's a custom database that they've written that provides a MySQL sort of compatible interface, but under the hood, it's doing its own replicated storage, right? And from I remember reading it, it's like it allocates these 10 gigabyte chunks on SSDs, and there's a whole sort of storage array, like storage infrastructure, to where each 10 gigabyte block is replicated. So they're doing sort of the smart storage, behind the scenes. So where there's some kind of, I don't know if it's blockable, but there's some kind of ongoing replication to provide fault tolerance and crash recovery, as well as you can add read replicas, and databases can go up to 64 terabytes without having to resize or restripe. So sort of an interesting approach, right, of providing sort of a quote unquote standard interface, but applying sort of modern best practices to distributed systems engineering and storage engineering under the hood.
Now, from a pricing perspective, where does it rank compared to MySQL on RDS? Is it about the same price, or?
I thought that they said it can be like up to 5x cheaper because of how it manages the storage under the hood. Just from like how like a current MySQL like RDS instance is like storage is allocated as well as like throughput, right? Because it's a custom sort of new breed of thing under the hood. You can get a lot more like I guess a QPS throughput with it compared to like an instant like a MySQL instance of a similar size. One thing to note is that this release is just it's a preview that you must request access to, and it's only in East 1 if you get access. Like a lot of the stuff that was launched this week is all in like preview, opt-in. So it's like for us, we do a lot of MySQL. We have some pretty well, medium. I don't want to say medium-ish. Terabytes to hundreds of terabytes sharded MySQL stuff in our infrastructure. That we're looking, part of it is like as we look to move more to AWS, like something like this, if it's mature in 6 to 12 months, as it matures and rolls out, is potentially really compelling compared to running our own or using RDS and stuff like that. So, but I do think it's interesting, and I think it's similar to what they did with Kinesis and with DynamoDB. They sort of took a look at like, all right, what are some of the best practices and building something and then baking their secret sauce into it.
Yeah, it'll be nice to see what people do with their existing stuff that has dependencies on MySQL now that they have basically a 3-click ability to get a highly available MySQL cluster that, we weren't able to do that before, at least that easily.
It is that those types of things are going to be interesting to see just how that impacts. Because even with RDS, like you still have to schedule your damn maintenance windows and all that crap in it. This will be fun to watch to see how well they handle that.
Yeah. So to me, what was interesting, and to be honest, I haven't spent much time reading about it besides like the announcements. But one of the compelling stuff was I think there's like 3 products together. They're calling like application lifecycle management. But there's like code deploy and code pipeline and code commit, right? There's like stuff around deployment, continuous delivery, source code control. Those to me were really interesting. Did anyone have a chance to like dig in deeper to them than just like the name and vaguely what they are?
Not yet.
I haven't yet. The code commit is going to be interesting to watch just to see where it goes in the sense of like GitHub is already like the big name in that space, and if you're not using GitHub, you seem that unless they're let's face it, Bitbucket has a lower price point, and I feel like there's one other one. Oh, GitLab has a lower price point in the hosted space, and you don't see droves of people going there that I'm aware of, but you do see behind the firewall.
Exactly. That's what I was going to point out. Is the people that are moving there aren't publicly announcing it because everyone that's on GitHub, it's public and everyone sees that they're on GitHub. But people that are using GitLab or Stash or something else that's behind the firewall, you just don't see it because it's behind the firewall. And that was one thing that I thought was interesting, where Amazon was kind of affirming with other announcements, affirming that Docker is the standard and affirming that MySQL is the standard. But they also, both of those aren't. They're making compatible APIs, but then they have this GitHub clone basically that they're like, oh yeah, but don't use GitHub either because we have that and you don't need it, and we have a cloud solution that you don't have to go to Bitbucket or someone else for it.
Enhance the lock-in basically.
Exactly.
Which makes sense too. I mean, if you're one bill for all your Amazon stuff, you don't want to. Oh yeah, I also have this GitHub Enterprise thing that. I mean, you can have that behind the firewall as well, but simplifying some of that billing, I'm sure, is appeal for a lot of people.
I think that only matters to finance departments, and generally speaking, for most of us that were in those environments, keeping that number lower. So not having to pay or keeping a separate AWS number and a separate GitHub number was positive because it meant that now I could actually charge both of them to the Pro card as separate transactions, and they didn't get flagged by finance. Yeah, I don't know. That's going to be interesting to see, and I'm right there with you, Justin. Like, I've seen tons of people moving to GitLab internally, but I haven't seen it in the public space. Like, I've seen a few. I occasionally see public repos on GitLab. I occasionally see public repos on Bitbucket, but it's not nearly as common as seeing stuff on GitHub.
What's the thing is GHG is pricey.
Oh my god.
You know, and so as these other things have matured, they become compelling. But it's like if you're going to be open source, then we'll just push a copy to GitHub too. And we run GHG internally, but we also put our we have github.com/lookout, and so a lot of stuff also goes there. This isn't own publicly when GitHub is already doing that, right? And it's that center. So to give these things a quick rundown, just from like it's the ALM page, right? You've got code deploy, which makes it easier. Basically, it's like release automation, handling, updating, scaling out, deploying your stuff. Code commits, which is basically private Git repositories, and then pipeline, which is continuous delivery and release automation. What I thought was interesting is one thing I did see, and I believe it was during the code deploy announcement. I'm gonna drill in here real quick. Is like they announced right away, like code deploy, like has integrations with a bunch of stuff. So like things like CodeShip and Travis CI and Jenkins and GitHub, right? Let's see, yeah, Circle CI, CodeShip, GitHub, Jenkins, Travis CI, and then code commit and code pipeline. So I think AWS is taking like sort of a balanced approach of hey, if you want to do everything with us, you can, but we also understand that if you're already happy with something else, then let's just tap into that. So I do think that is interesting. And not that we need to get into the nuances of build versus buy, and sometimes the fact that people whitewash vendor lock-in is ignoring the fact that like not every ops engineering has the time and talent to make these things core competencies, and that's a whole other episode we've done. But I do like this, that I think AWS, this of course as a commercial company they're going to encourage a certain amount of we'll call it lock-in, but they are still recognizing the fact there are other things and then shipping with support for them. I think that they're playing well in the community as well as they can as a commercial entity.
Yeah, this kind of thing, I think it's going to appeal to a lot of enterprise kind of places where, like they were saying before, it's all in one bill and it's all provided by one service and it's all basically in that network. I talked to one guy who said he wasn't really able to use our service unless we were in AWS and specifically in US East, because that way his data didn't go very far. So this might appeal to companies like that who are kind of freaked out.
Well, I mean, one thing that's interesting is that we're all basically rebuilding the same software. So, I mean, Amazon listened to their customers. Everyone I've talked to had to create their own build, deploy, automation software. So it makes sense from a new startup, if you're a new company or whatever, that you want to just have something there for you. So I could see that be compelling from that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I mean, I hate to use the old example of IBM, but like, no one ever got fired for buying, IBM. This falls a lot into that same line of, okay, well, we already have an AWS account. What's a couple, what's 10 or 15 bucks on that AWS account initially as we start to use some of these tools? And it isn't until, it hits epic proportion where now it actually makes a difference that anyone cares. So by having a lot of these tools, I think it becomes an enabler for a lot of our friends that are in enterprises that are a little more stodgy, because now it's like, oh, well, we have AWS, we're doing cloud. And then I don't have to go, as someone in the enterprise, I don't have to go out to now explain why I'm using Travis CI or insert other thing. I can just, we've got an AWS account and they gave me full access, so clickety-click, I've got code deploy stuff going, and and we're doing CI without having to answer the question, well, why did you install Jenkins? Why are you running a Jenkins instance? because no one actually notices the $15 on the bill, that type of thing.
Well, let's call a spade, a pig, a pig. I don't know. I forget what the proper one is, but most folks, I think, neither have the time nor necessarily even the inclination to like up and move. Like once you're in AWS, you know, most organizations, they're just going to be in AWS. You know what I mean? Like it's. I think sometimes we can gloss over how non-trivial it is in some of these kind of discussions to forklift to something else. You know what I mean? So it's like, yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that. Beyond I do think sometimes that can be a little glossed over. Like, well, if you start using all this stuff, then you get like locked in. Like it's non-trivial to replace these things or like up and like move your, you know, what cloud you're using anyway. So.
Well, isn't that the point of what Amazon announced, where they, you know, they're making all these entry points really easy? Where, hey, do you want to get into MySQL? We have that. Do you want to get into Docker? We have that. Make them just get started and make that barrier to entry super low, because that barrier going into Google Compute or into Rackspace is going to be a lot higher than going over to AWS. So once you're into AWS, you know the commands, you know the APIs, so you're, you know, why waste time on something else, even if it is better? And if your financial department already agrees that, hey, yeah, we'll build to AWS, then you don't have to make a reason or, you know, big case to say, hey, let's go over to Google Compute now.
Yeah, and it's non-trivial to build an entire build pipeline and orchestration to roll it out, sometimes depending on your environment. And so if they make it a lot easier, then yeah, you know, that's that easy way in, right? You press the easy button.
Yeah, well, I think my point is that self-hosting is hard, and I think sometimes that gets glossed over because as computer people we think, you know, it's just software, I can just make it run. And like, especially if you look at like the features checklist, like, you know, then it might seem easy, like, but like this, it's not easy to build and run this stuff.
I mean, to play devil's advocate, you know, Amazon has a double-edged sword by providing really compelling products and services that are really, really good, but yet not open source. It's going to have some level of stickiness for the product. I think one of the key things that was talked about a lot during this conference was the aspect of all in. I mean, where I'm at Pinterest, we're all 100% on Amazon Web Services, and there's quite a bit of discussion about people moving away from co-location facilities and going 100% cloud, kind of like Intuit or vice versa, because kind of to your point, it is very, very difficult to run very efficient, high-scale builds.
And I tend to agree with Jeremy, and I think there's a distinction here. Like there's the self-hosting discussion, like, oh, I should run my own hardware, and then there's which is my favorite one, we need to be, you know, cloud agnostic and all this crap, and it's like, okay, well, y'all are the same people that locked us into Oracle and, you know, went down the road of PeopleSoft. So like I hate to break it to you, but that's much worse than any of this cloud stuff. Like at this point, yes, is it hard to move things around? Yeah, but is it? I still think it is easier to take a workload that's currently on AWS and to move it to Azure or to Google Compute or to I guess Rackspace is getting out of the business, but or to DigitalOcean. I mean, depending on what your needs are. The key though is, and this is why I think Amazon is like succeeding, is like they've got the entire thing right down to the point of how many of the other cloud providers come anywhere close when it comes time to the networking discussion. How many other cloud providers have all the additional things where you can just be like, oh, I really don't want to run the Redis. I'm just going to go create an Elasticache instance.
Most other providers barely even have something comparable to ELB, let alone higher order stuff.
Very true.
You know, but that's the part. Like if your workload is fairly static and you're literally just like getting VMs from EC2 and maybe some block storage, then yeah, it's easy to move. But like a complex, you know, microservice type of a thing is just where, yeah, we get into these nuances. But like this is definitely like a I don't think that stickiness is necessarily a bad thing for most people, and I think most people don't even have the desire to like resist the stickiness. That I think is maybe my summary. But let's not go too far down that rat hole today. We can maybe revisit it another day. Because I did want to get into the Docker, all the things stuff as Darren mentioned, but I did want to see if anyone had read about the Lambda thing, which is I don't even really know what to call it. If it's like I don't even know, is it a pass? I'm not entirely sure like what it is.
I know I'm excited about it. That's for sure. Like if the only thing that it does for me is when I do things to S3, go do other things, like I am excited. The ability to have my boxes like upload a backup to S3 and then have code, on demand, take that event and do something with it, like that's huge to me.
So what is Lambda? Can you summarize it? Because I can't.
It's event-driven compute is the way I understood it. So basically, you have an event. I'm not sure what kinds of events you have. I'm guessing you can probably trigger it from, via HTTP. So the idea being that, you can actually call a URL. But the thing that for me as an ops person that was like, oh my God, was you can trigger it off of S3 events. So when something happens in S3, it'll go just arbitrarily run code.
Mm-hmm. It works with S3, with Kinesis, and with DynamoDB.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, the one drawback, at least the initial one, is that you have to write this stuff in Node.js or JavaScript that can run on Node.js. So I think hopefully in the future they'll get more other types of languages. It makes sense to start there. I think the event-driven computing stuff is really, really cool. I'm just trying to figure out how we would leverage it, because personally I don't write JavaScript or vice versa, but trying to figure out how we can leverage it.
That's Atwood's law, right? Anything that can be written in JavaScript will get written in JavaScript. I mean, hell, Windows is all like JavaScripty on the front end now too. So like, I think that it is one of those languages that we're all just going to have to learn, for better or for worse.
Yeah, I think the real savings comes down to is that individuals have been running compute to process event-driven things, but they run all the time. So one thing this could do is help out drive down a lot of costs for people that just have event variable workloads. They give some example of Netflix doing transcoding on the fly and upload. Now, I don't know personally if they're actually writing JavaScript video transcoders. I mean, that seems a little bit incredible to me. But, I mean, it is kind of an interesting use case that you don't have to run. It's kind of like auto-scaling, but for events, different computers. Kind of interesting.
Well, you could even do something along the lines of, you use the Lambda code, and I wouldn't be surprised if what they're doing is, okay, so you get the event that comes in that these things need to be transcoded. 10 of them have come in, and we now have 10 in the queue. Because this was the 10th one, now go spin up the transcoding cluster, because it takes us about an hour to process all 10, and at the end the transcoding cluster shuts itself down. But you can do event-driven like infrastructure if you want to, like craziness in that way. But I'm not sure that that's the way they're handling it. But you could definitely do things like that.
It's kind of interesting to think about whether people are going to be using this for like ETL purposes, and if that means that they're engineering a complete service out of it, or whether it's just going to be the glue for most people, right? Because it can also just be the glue that puts the pieces together, because that's also something that's pretty valuable, right? But it's interesting that, considering that aspect, that SQS isn't front and center, right? SQS is still something that's coming, they say, in the future, but it's not part of the initial offering, which I think is kind of interesting, because that seems like the de facto foundation for something like this, in my mind. But S3 is a great start for ETL for sure, as well as something like transcoding.
Yeah, I think from an ops side of things, it's going to be a very much so a glue thing that we all use to do event-driven things like ETL, like transcoding, like just any of those event-driven crap. And, I put this thing up on S3. It now needs to go do some other random thing, or I need to go now spin up a cluster to process all the crap that's now in S3, and then spin down, and the cluster spins itself down, or those types of gluey things that we would have had to run separately.
My first thought on doing that was doing something with Packer, like doing something like a event-driven builds through Packer.
That could be really neat.
Yeah, I think most people are in the wait and see type thing, like how we can actually use it. Because I think I have more questions than answers about that. So, like, for example, can they call back to my infrastructure kind of like a webhook, or how does that security and that isolation go? So it's one of those things I think we have to do a lot more reading on their API documentation than ever, but it seems pretty limited at what it can do, at least in the initial onset.
I would agree with.
They add more languages too. That would be nice.
I just feel like I'm at the point in my career where learning Node is no longer an option, which makes me kind of sad, but at the same time, I think it's a thing I need to do.
I feel the same way about Go too. Like everything I'm seeing around CoreOS, and every time I see something from Kelsey Hightower, I'm like, oh man, I gotta learn Go now.
Yeah, that too. Go, and Adam Jacob was recently talking about Rust too. I need to go read his article about it because that'll be interesting. What I do appreciate is it doesn't look like I'm going to have to learn Erlang, even though I work at Chef. But that's a whole other discussion around languages and all that funness.
I thought we were going to start. I thought that all the cookbooks were going to be converted to Erlang next year.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, well, I actually was thinking like something that might be fun. A fun way to play with Lambda is like I've been meaning to start doing like another copy of my backups into S3, and then hook in like Glacier. It might be fun to like wire in something with Lambda to like notify me, when backups happen or something, just to play with it.
Ooh, that would be kind of cool, actually. And I like once again, this is I wonder if you can do this in JavaScript. Oh, I'm sure you can. But to have your initial backup go to S3 and then have it.
Really.
How about now? All right. But basically take your backups and push them across to GCE.
Oh. Yeah, something. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see. Okay. We might as well get to what's probably super interesting for a lot of us, as I'm sure, this building something like this was on our radar, and now it looks like we might be able to use it. The Amazon Elastic Compute Cloud Container Service, ECCCS, E3S. I don't know. Anyway, so it's basically it's orchestration for Docker. It is, I believe, there's also a Docker Hub registry-ish sort of a thing in it. So not surprising, but really cool.
Yeah, I mean, my observation of this conference has been that Docker is kind of reaching its really ramping up in its hype cycle right now. When I went to the actual conversation, their presentation that Nathaniel was giving, there was no room. There was a line all the way around the corner. They were completely at capacity, turning people away at the door. I mean, it just goes to show you that there's a lot of interest in this type of technology. But one thing that was, from my perspective, I couldn't really get viewpoints of people running this in production yet. They brought out some people like Guild Group using it and some smaller startups or whatnot. But I think everyone's just in that very curious stage right now.
I think even the companies that are trying to compete with that are in the curious stage. I mean, look at Project Atomic from Red Hat, or I mean, there's so many different platforms to host your containers that are supposed to be, you don't have to worry about the infrastructure, you only worry about the containers. I mean, CoreOS, that's the whole idea, is it's self-updating, and what would be the benefit of going directly through Amazon's container service versus having CoreOS instances that are self-updating that you barely manage, that can do your own containers, and you probably have other features that CoreOS is probably going to iterate on faster than Amazon will.
Yeah, the thing that was really interesting from my perspective was that Amazon came out with this announcement. So I know there's a lot of conflicting things out there from cloud providers, like Google's work on Kubernetes and all the ecosystem around that. So it's kind of like an Amazon Me Too almost right now. So instead of letting it be specifically a Google-driven technology, like come over to Google, run containers here, everyone's doing that Me Too offering. I think this is just the initial onset. It's currently in preview. Most likely they'll iterate on this for a period of time.
Well, and I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see where all of this goes, right? Like, I don't know. I guess I'm too. I've officially adopted a neckbeard because I'm very much so interested to see how Docker even works in people's environments. Because I think for a lot of people, it's such a departure from the way that we do business today that a lot of places are going to deploy it and then get halfway through their deployments and go, "Oh my God, what have we done?" Type situations. But that's maybe that's just me being a pessimist.
Yeah, it's not actually easy to deploy. Part of what I've been doing for the past few months have been preparing so that we're even able to, because some of the natural things that happen with an ops lifecycle where your chef recipes get complicated and get maybe a little bit too integrated. So it is quite hard to deploy, I think, just because of the nature of a lot of the business.
Well, what I worry about is all the ancillary stuff, because it's like, I hate to say it, but like the actual deploying of an application, this I get that this is solving that problem, but that's only a very small portion of the problem, right? Like, where are your logs going? How are you controlling? How are you doing debugging? How are you, like? There's just a lot of those little things that I don't think we're answering that question for. And what scares me the most is that I'm seeing a lot of movement away from the original promise of Docker, right? Like the idea of, oh, I can ship this container, and this is cool, which makes a lot of sense to me if you're just running a Node app or you're running a Rail like a Sinatra app where you don't have to like you can just spin up the process and not have to think about all of like daemonizing and all that crap. It just runs the process. That's badass to me. What scares me is like how are we going to manage things like logging and actually controlling the number of containers running now, and how do we debug state? Like, if you're in a Rails environment, how do you jump into the running process and running instance and go Rails console, that type of thing. So I don't know. I'm skeptical. I think it's a neat technology. I think what they're doing is super, super useful for a lot of things. I'm always worried about the ancillary stuff that we've never seemed to get good at, like logging.
Yeah, I mean, I think right now there's a lot more questions than answers. Everyone's asking everyone else at the conference how they do things. I think people are just interested. But you kind of hit on a couple of things there. I think there's actually becoming a resurgence of the write once, run anywhere architecture that the JVM and Java languages popularized a long time ago. That you can write your code, and as long as you just have a very simple kernel or JVM in each machine, your code will run. And I think that Docker's kind of breaking down a lot of the friction, and especially the keynote, that when they're actually talking about that, from developers getting things into production quickly, because it solves a lot of their problems. The binary packing, environment, a little bit of the deployment. Now the implementation details, I think, is where we're all kind of getting lost in. Like layering, UnionFS, how to monitor it, network performance in that. But cluster management, resource schedulers, it's all very complicated. But I think that these things will change quite rapidly, and then people will ultimately settle. I think Docker's starting to become trying to be that standard. So instead of having everyone just compete on this stuff, I let that be the nugget of how you actually encapsulate stuff.
Makes sense.
I really like that in code commit there was no file size limits, and there was no like repo size limits. Like in GitHub, you can only have 100 meg per file size, and so you can almost kind of like roll your own Docker Hub inside of EC2 without having to go any external calls.
Oh, interesting. That's not a bad idea. Although, if you're using code commit for that, are you basically shoving a binary file into a Git repo?
Yeah, and then that's all code commit. They say explicitly you can save codes, you can save binaries, you can save any file, and there's no file size limits. So I thought that was pretty cool.
My inner, like, I've abused Git too much person is a little worried about that, but yes, that would be badass, because then you could just like, oh, it's in the repo.
Yeah, and I think there was some talk, at least in the documentation. There's very, very little information actually how this offering works, and it's an invite-only mode right now. But I believe they were saying they were actually trying to do S3 private Docker, hub for your business. But I don't know if that's actually the case. It's very little information.
Yeah, I think part of the change to containers is about what we're used to from managing instances almost, and part of the shift will be that it doesn't even matter. Your scheduler puts out enough containers that you need for that purpose and spins up more, hopefully. But it's a way different way to even think about it. That some of us who are used to managing nodes, sometimes like cattle, or sometimes, sorry, like pets instead of cattle, this will be a bit of a change for us.
I think a major roadblock that I'm always reminded of when I think about containers is that we've built this common practice of instrumenting around deploys and around running servers, so that we have all this visibility now into running processes and all the telemetry data that is flowing through a server. And all that sort of goes out the window as soon as we start looking at containers. We're back to square one, where it's like you can't run an agent. You got to be running a process inside of a container to follow the rules. And so everything becomes, how do you reach inside now and get that same data? And I'm really curious to see how New Relic and the rest of the sort of RPM or APM vendors deal with this new paradigm of having to work inside of a single process world.
Well, I think some of it moves up the stack, right? Like with CoreOS, right? Their decision to embed systemd at the heart of things, right? They're hooking into systemd to extract that stuff. So sort of, you move some of that up the stack into your hosts, right? Essentially your hypervisor sort of role. But it does change that for some things, especially agent-based stuff. Other things, like if you're maybe more of an advanced engineering shop, more mature, you just start embedding more outputs.
Exactly.
Your whatever code is running like under your PID 1 is your daemon essentially. Like if you're doing stuff on the JVM or whatever, you're building a big fat jar. You put some stuff in there that runs that either emits stuff, out to like statsd or to a logging endpoint, or you start exposing more. You expose all the stuff by some kind of a little HTTP interface and collect it that way. Jeremy, can you talk a little bit, sort of how you guys have done some of the push and pull based monitoring stuff you're doing? Because I think some of those ideas are applicable in this kind of world. Even though you're not containerizing stuff, it's still, I think, some of the same practices.
Right. I think the reason why it's kind of difficult to do a lot of these things, and you hit on a really good point about whoever mentioned about the cattle versus pets, is that in these container world, there's a lot of technology that a lot of companies haven't built internally that really, really are almost critical to the operation of that type of environment. An example is if I just schedule an arbitrary task, and that task runs inside of a container somewhere, I need to know where it is so I can discover it, so that if I need to communicate with it, I know where it is. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there now in the open source realm, like Console Template, SED, Zookeeper, vice versa. And also the resource schedulers to work with those type of systems to redo work when things fail or vice versa. So there's just a lot of a paradigm shift on the way you do that. And then, of course, you kind of hit like how your monitoring system has to change. So then it has to be more, dynamically driven. So like, for example, I have a new workload that comes up. I know where it is. Then I can actually start pulling metrics from it or vice versa. So it kind of changes the stuff, and I think that's the reason why people get lost in the implementation details of these type of systems. Like, how do I run collect D inside my container, for example? So they can start emitting metrics or vice versa. Where does it actually send the metrics to? Because do I run the collect receiver or vice versa as a container as well? So how does that whole flow thing work? And I think that's where a lot of the questions, it seems really, really cool when we see all those demos with fleet control, Docker host, right versa. You just run all this stuff like crazy and it spins up super, super quick. But it's harder to kind of get in production. Like, how do I monitor it to invest to do that? But I think every company doesn't want to implement that, so they're looking for Docker and the suite of third-party people in that environment to kind of help solve that.
Yeah, I think that was something that our CTO had in his talk on Thursday, was about how to monitor containers, and yeah, we're still really working through a lot of that because it's not a simple problem, and it does change it, quite a bit.
I mean, one technique that other people have done, and we do ourselves at Pinterest, is that if you have a common port for metrics and a common language to describe metrics, then we can just look at all the applications running in our environment and then know exactly how to pull metrics from them. An example is that our application code, when they bring up, we use some other open source projects, but we have like an admin port interface and a URL to get statistics out in JSON format. So when you launch in our environment, you register yourself with Zookeeper to advertise to the cluster your availability. So we use that for service discovery. And then our monitoring system can then find that information and pull metrics from it, rather than a push model. So that's one way to do it. But I think that it requires a lot of people to get together and start writing applications in that way, which is kind of harder. And I'm thinking that the ecosystem with containers now is, if you want to integrate with all these things, it's very difficult because everyone has a different way of doing something.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, spinning up processes, can't you always just go around the quick hack that Test Kitchen does and spin everything into a SSH daemon process?
Yeah, I guess you could do that.
If you're running Docker 1.3, there's also a new Docker exec command that basically just runs anything inside the container. So Docker exec bash will get you into that at a bash prompt without needing SSH or something else, which is really nice.
Yes, I was using that, and it's lovely.
Yeah, I'm trying to push for as many systems here to get Docker 1.3 because I'm really sick of trying to get into a container manually without having that backdoor kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's where the distinction kind of gets lost, is that for us, I mean, we don't run containers or Docker or anything at this time, but everyone, of course, is looking at it. But we look at it like, how do I launch processes? And the processes will then have information about profiling, tracing, metrics, and monitoring, vice versa. So in that regard, we don't. I think some of the challenges that Docker stuff is more like a little mini virtual environment, its own root volumes and vice versa. You can run your daemons, and I think that distinction makes these type of implementation details a little bit more challenging. In our environment right now, we mainly focus on how do we execute applications, but not necessarily lightweight VMs like container stuff currently is today.
Yeah, we're looking at introducing console to the mix to help with some of that service discovery and registering the daemons that you need and even pushing metrics outside of containers. So console looks to be how we're going to start, but we'll see as that rolls out.
Yeah, I mean, I would implore anybody that doesn't have any of these types of systems today that the console, I know that I think you, Brandon, are looking at that over at Lookout. I mean, for us, I mean, we've had a lot of engineering effort into applications registering with Zookeeper, and then having the watchers inside of Zookeeper rewrite HA proxy files or varnish files or Nginx files or whatever, and then reload those processes so that they can belong as part of the cluster fleet. But I mean, nowadays with a lot of open source technology, people don't have to take all that engineering effort up front using some of the things that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we are currently using console. We're using it in a few places for HA proxy, and we're preparing to sort of revamp that with a console template driving all of the HA proxy, and we're looking at sort of an HA proxy on localhost on each box approach with some service dependency kind of declaration stuff in Chef that will determine like what HA proxy stanzas get laid down on which boxes, saying like I need this Elasticsearch or I need that other web service or I need that MySQL, and then only those will get laid down and sort of port assignment using just some deterministic string hashing, sort of like service name equals some 4-number port or 5-number port kind of stuff. Actually, one of our core systems engineers is going to be he's written it up, and we're going through our internal process to open source a Lookout console template, Chef Cookbook.
Oh,
so,
cool.
so we'll have that one out, and then I think also there's a HA proxy companion cookbook that we're kind of making that's driven off console template that will kind of we're also working on. So those should be out there soon. Yeah, so there's some interesting stuff there, and I think console. We're actually another way we're using console is I'm just using the key value store for our sort of AMI library, like AMI IDs. We do a structure where it's like region, instance size, and then sort of a three-tiered thing, like say like Ubuntu precise 12.04 or sorry no like dot one, right, or like service / like environment / and then like a version number, sort of a three thing, and then we have stuff in our provisioning that queries console to based on like a search string to determine what AMI it should use. We kind of did that because we were like, all right, we want to store these somewhere we don't want to do live queries every time we're doing deploys, of AMIs. We want like a local cache. We're like, we already have this highly available key value store. And further down the road, it's like, actually having applications use console for service discovery is definitely on the horizon. I think for us, kind of phase one is, as we're moving to AWS, we kind of want to try to get to that like building and shipping AMIs, and for some things with Packer, and for other things, it's a lot of like, we're doing a lot of JRuby, so it's sort of building wars and jars and shipping like a fat jar. And then I think a natural extension to both of those is to start like, how can we integrate Docker, right? Like instead of just a jar, you sort of do a Docker container around it. Instead of an AMI, can we do a Docker container? Kind of from both ends, move into the middle, especially the containerization. A lot of it is it cuts down, startup time and deployment time. And if your build process and deployment process is all hooked in with CI, adding in that Docker piece is a little more, assuming that you've got the ecosystem around it with like logging and metrics and monitoring and stuff. But like, and that's kind of the approach that we're looking at is how can we use container further out? How can we use containers to to their advantage around like the speed and the portability to a certain extent. Once we have all that underlying fabric that we're talking about in place,
Right. I mean, I think the core just a question for the community in general is Docker going to provide this, or the ecosystem? Are you going to rely on their state machine for service discovery, or does everyone have to do like a console sidecar, or etcd sidecar, or something of that nature? That's an open-ended question.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see how the EC2 container stuff hooks in with this. It looks like right off the bat they're using Amazon Linux instances as the container, like the host. But they talk about third-party integration will be coming. So interesting to see like once you can use this with say like CoreOS. If you could deploy like a CoreOS plus Kubernetes fleet, and then but then manage like some of the scheduling and deployment with EC2 CS.
Yeah, I think I read that you could do it as long as you have a Docker daemon running, and they have some kind of I think their scheduler that you need to install. So I think you can do it other than on Amazon Linux, but not totally clear yet.
Yeah, they said like third-party Docker hosts are coming, and they even mentioned like integrating with your own scheduler, Kronos, Marathon, hooking in with your own CI. So it'll be like I feel like a lot of the stuff that announced this week is compelling because there's a gradient to how much you opt into it and how much you can plug in your own stuff. So it's like you can tap into some of their engineering and their APIs, but still do your own. And that's I definitely think conversations my team will be having this year, because a lot of our work is around deployment automation, service delivery, and as it's like, what do we want to build ourselves, or and where do we want to hook in? And I like that there is a certain amount of opt-in to this stuff.
You kind of got it right on the opt-in. Like, for example, the resource schedulers. I mean, there's a lot of talk around Mesos, custom schedulers, Kubernetes, kind of to work with those systems to do the service discovery, relaunch systems when they fail. But I think these are so new techniques to everyone that it just goes to show everyone's really, really excited and very interested in this stuff. And hopefully over a period of time, the work will go and make it stable and a lot more approachable for everybody's perspective.
And everyone's rushing to build containers, but for some things, containers don't even make sense. Like we have some services that take a box and use all of the CPU and all of the RAM. And so do we make a container host with one container? Like, does that even make sense? So, I think you have to take a look at your infrastructure and where your bottlenecks are, and then how to even use that in a container mindset. So.
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the things that has been sitting in the back of my mind since Docker came out.
Yeah. No,
is like Postgres, MySQL, and like
no.
the data volume mount stuff to me is maybe like only 10% of the answer.
Yeah, but before I was at Datadog, I built a small Docker, kind of like Doku clone, I guess. It's called Octahost, and it worked really, really good for isolating very small websites from each other. So you had a 4 megabyte Nginx website, and you could run dozens and dozens of them without work at all, and that worked great for that use case. But some of the other things, again, you just have to see, does this even make sense to waste time on putting that in a container? Sometimes I think the answer is no still.
Yeah, I think that drove a lot of the initial interest behind Docker, and why you saw sort of big companies jumping all over it was that for very specific use cases, like if you are a hosting provider, it just makes sense, right? Because you're not responsible for anything around just getting people a container, right? And you can sort of build out all the metrics and telemetry and integrations after the fact. You really just wanted people in the door, and that was a really easy use case for them, right? It's like it was a no-brainer there, and that interest from very large organizations was a big boost. But at shops where they've got to do everything, and they're trying to look at doing everything with Docker, it just gets pretty hairy very soon.
Yeah, I agree.
My mouse disappeared. Okay, so we just try to keep these to an hour. We're kind of at the top of the hour. And we managed to spend the whole hour on AWS and reInvent stuff, which I think is cool. Some of the container stuff is definitely almost an infinite conversation. I think next week we're going to at least partially recap Lisa, which is still going on today. Jerome from Docker was going to try to join us, but was got stuck on another call. So I'm going to try to line up a few people next week to talk about that. So
that's awesome.
We'll wrap it up there. Thank you, everyone, for your time, and have a good weekend. Safe travels home.
Cheers.
Thanks, Rob.